ladies and gentlemen, Jeff McDonald is receiving numerous accolades in the Netherlands at the moment, so he's not here. So I have to do the introduction. So welcome to the Distinguished Lecture Series. And Jeff usually thanks me for funding it at this point. So I would like to thank the Canada Excellence Research Chair, and that actually is the federal government and the university and the province who is supporting this initiative. It enables us to bring in terrific people every week, and it's really a pleasure to introduce Charlie Vorosmarty to you. So Charlie's one of those people that you can say he doesn't need any introduction, but I'll give you one. So he's at the City University of New York, and I think I associate it with Charlie as kind of inventing global hydrology, and he's certainly been one of the people who's really taken global perspectives through modeling and analysis of hydrology and water resources, and has produced a whole stream of definitive papers that set out the challenges that we're facing with respect to water resources and particularly the biodiversity threats. So he's done many things. He's a founding member and co-chair of the Global Water System Project. He was appointed scientific co-chair of the Arctic Futures Initiative of the Arctic Council and the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, EASA. He's served on a whole range of national panels, and that includes the U.S. Arctic Research Commission appointed by Presidents Bush and Obama, and he's currently a member of the National Research Council Review Committee on the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Before I introduce him, let me just welcome listeners out there and viewers out there. This series is simulcast, but also it's videotaped. And interestingly, Charlie, some of our lecturers have had 1,500 downloads. So there's an audience in the whole world listening to you here today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. The floor is yours.
Can you all hear me now? I guess you can, because I could hear myself. Thanks, Howard, for that nice introduction. And I also wanted to thank any of the people who have helped me today to meet your really interesting students and postdocs and senior researchers. And in sort of taking stock of the many meetings that I had today, you're really doing some very interesting, cutting-edge research. And I'm hoping that this is the first of several visits. I'd love to be able to collaborate with this group because I think you're really doing some spectacular work. And I think it's going to be really easy to talk to this crowd because I think you're already pre-primed for the messages that I'm about to share with you. So the title of my talk here is Freshwater Debates. I'll explain what that is in a moment or two. And subtext here is Simmering Battles in the water sciences, assessment, and management communities. And if you thought that the world of global hydrology was a nice, calm, placid discipline, it's hardly the case. There are all sorts of things brewing within our community, and we're going to show you the dirty underwear of our particular discipline in a couple of minutes here. I did want to mention that what I am about to show you is the product of team-based research, and I had a long diatribe with the postdocs about the necessity of team-based research, and all of what I'm about to show you is not anything I did by myself. It was really a culmination of literally many years of discussions and hard research that we did as groups of collaborators. And I really want to stress, especially to the young people in the audience here, that it's really critical to be able to engage in team-based research. That's as I mentioned today, the bread and butter of what we do, and you ought to get used to that pretty quickly. Okay, so let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so I'm going to tackle this issue with the help of what I call leaders or luminaries from the arena of science, government, commerce, and sports. But before I begin the formal part of my lecture, I did want to give a little bit of an advertisement to my new home institution. It's called the Advanced Science Research Center at the City University of New York. The symbolism there is that little tilted cube with different colored faces to it. This is a major investment that the City University has made in something that is culminating in something called a Decade of Science, where we laid out more than $1 billion of investment to take the university from fundamentally a teaching perspective to put it on a sounder footing with respect to research. There are 5 floors that are occupied by the building shown on the right here, and we're in the top floor, sharing the space with all the other floors below us with those who are engaged in cutting-edge nanotechnology research and photonics research, neurobiology, and structural biochemistry. And to be honest, I never thought there would be a day when I felt we'd ever see environmental sciences on par with all of these very, very important cutting-edge, high-technology realms. Our mission is a broad mission. You probably could find similar statements if you cruise the web and looked in environmental institutes. We want to create a major focal point, a dialogue place, as it were, a crossroads. New York City being, at least when I grew up as a kid in New York City was considered the crossroads of the world for commerce and culture and business. I still think that it is, maybe not the only one, but certainly it is an important crossroads. We want to bring together the appropriate parties to dialogue, to first of all identify strategic 21st century environmental questions, and then to try to craft interdisciplinary solutions. And again, those are broad words that you probably could find elsewhere. What we think is probably important about what we're trying to do here is we're trying to underpin the general statement with some very quantitative information. So what we want to try to do is we want to go beyond simply the theoretical aspects of these questions and dive into them in much more concrete ways that you couldn't unless you were in the business of monitoring what's happening with respect to the Earth through advanced remote sensing, through chemical quantitation. We're setting up laboratories to look, for example, at stable isotopes in the environment and looking at esoteric engineered chemicals and how that might affect human health in the city, on and on. But the icons at the bottom are trying to capture the fact that we're talking about very broad issues here, but we're going to try to quantify them as best we can. Okay, so on to the debates. So back in November of 2014, I was a member of, I guess, a selected group of researchers who came to the offices of AAAS, the published science magazine. It's back in November, and we were asked to share our insights as to some interesting topics that Science magazine could begin to feature in its pages. 5 or 6 of us drawn together around the table, outsiders plus the editors themselves, and we gave our talks. I think we were allowed about a half hour each, and of course, as you might expect from the introduction, I gave a talk about global scale hydrology or global scale water systems. And I gave my dog and pony show, and I made a statement that we really need to understand this dimension of the water system, that is the global dimension, or else we're really not going to be able to do a good job of managing water at the more local scales, to which that statement was responded to very vocally and very assertively. And we had a debate around the table on this very issue, and then we decided that, well, maybe the best place to continue this debate after that day was over would be on the pages of Science, and that's in fact what we did. I suggested to the editors to go slightly beyond the debate that they witnessed in front of their very eyes, local versus global, what's the best approach to solving our water problems in the future, and to address a couple of other issues which I will unveil as we go through the discussion. You can find these set of dialogues, these debates, from the end of July through early August issues of Science. Okay, so the first one is local versus global. And we thought we had some pretty nifty graphics which were jettisoned by the editors, and they produced this graphic, which I think is not a bad capturing of the ideas that we're going to be talking about. There's very nice image at the bottom is of the continents and how the continents are connected ultimately to what happens at the local scale. And I think this really does capture what we're talking about. Okay, so I'm going to go through these quotes. So quote number one is from, I guess, the world of commerce and tourism, actually. And there was this famous saying, I don't know if it's still used, what happens here stays here. You might have heard it as what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, but I think the original was what happens here stays here. That was coined by an advertising agency for the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority more than 10 years ago. And it's sort of a statement that you come across from time to time. And I thought I would try to use it in the context of justifying a global perspective on water. So if you believe it, you can go to Las Vegas and you could participate in an Elvis lookalike contest, maybe even win the contest, but not have to tell anyone. Or if you wanted to get married, you could go through a drive-through, and I think there's probably a drive-through divorce window as well somewhere down the street, so no one really has to know. But anyway, so I want you to remember this. What happens here stays here. This is not the case in terms of water. And that's why I think we need something other than simply local perspectives. Much of our knowledge, our perspectives on, and our interventions in terms of water systems and solving our water problems are really cast at the local scale. And there's a very, very deep tradition of looking at water challenges at the very localist of scales, whether we're talking about issues as diverse as sanitation and access to clean drinking water, where we're talking literally about getting water to individual families and individuals themselves, or if we're talking about climate change, which may have, let's say, regional dimensions to it, certainly has a global dimension, but we're used to seeing floods happen like you recently experienced, was it 3 years ago? Very devastating floods, which were, it made the news because it was a local punctuated event. Droughts may also be regional, but they're occurring within a place, like the California drought. Okay, we talk about that as a place-based phenomenon. Engineered water, I have an engineering degree. I see all sorts of students coming from all corners of the earth who learned how to design dams and reservoirs, who learned how to design wastewater treatment facilities. They know how to design single treatment facilities. They know how to design single dams. They can write out the equations. They could hand in the assignments. They can get an A on the assignments. If they're actually working in the private sector, they can get paid for these plans and they can construct these things. And then they go on to the next facility. And I'll show you why that's a dangerous way to look at the world, or at least it is from a biodiversity perspective. And again, this is locally thought out. Urban water systems, you could argue that urban water delivery systems are all very, very unique in their requirements and their delivery systems and the ways that water needs to be treated and delivered to the city dwellers. Agriculture and water, you're talking about particular delivery of either surface water or groundwater, perhaps if you're irrigating, to individual farms or individual fields. And individual farmers in many cases throughout the world. Very localized in terms of our concerns. Ecosystem services are yielded by our water systems. Here's just one example, fisheries, which is really, really important as a protein source in many parts of the world, in particular the developing world. And where ecosystems fail, you hear about this, and these locally affect human beings. If you talk about water for development, water for example, for our electricity sector, you're often thinking about how it will impact particular plants, put them under particular stressful situations, let's say during the summer when there's low flow, and whether that particular plant has to be turned on or turned off in order to meet peak demand. And then wherever there are any interactions, substantial interactions with human beings, and their water systems, whether for growing crops or where rivers run through cities, you always see a signature of human impact in terms of pollution. And this is pandemic, as I will demonstrate in a short while. But we often talk about it in terms of local insults. And Howard and I were talking about mercury pollution in the drainage basin close by. And so that's an individual, local scale issue. Okay, now the debate in some sense started more than a year ago. It actually occurred in September of 2009 when I actually had another debate with someone at a public forum, actually at the River Symposium in Brisbane, Australia, where I was challenged by Mike Muller to say, well, all this global stuff is ridiculous. He says that water is a profoundly local resource, and I know where he's coming from. And I'm not saying that water is not a profoundly local resource, but it does have a dimensionality at regional, continental, and global scales, and if we miss understanding that, we really miss the boat in terms of solving our local scale problems, and I'll show evidence for why I and others believe that increasingly. Okay, so in this first debate where we had the global perspective, we make two important points: that even though you might be concerned about local scale phenomena, local environments sit within a global context, and they really do sit within a global climate system, and the global climate system has one of its key elements the phase and the distributions and the fluxes of water. And this image at the top is something called atmospheric water vapor fluxes. You call them atmospheric rivers, if you will. And it shows some of the main features of how water is lofted off of the oceans that have a net evaporative loss relative to precipitation. And that stuff gets thrown onto the continents and becomes the source material for all of our water supplies at some level. And that's part of a global system. We don't argue whether it's global climate change. We don't say climate change without the word global. So if water is part of the global climate, I don't understand why we can't be thinking about how there's a global water system that affects local phenomena. So that was one of our arguments. The other argument is that in addition to these natural fluxes of water, which you see in the top diagram, you also see what we call virtual water flows, flows of water that are really tagged along with the international trade networks. And this is something called virtual water, where if you wanted to if you wanted to feed your population, for example, in Europe, you couldn't do that in situ. You don't have enough agricultural land and productivity to feed everyone in Europe. So you've got to go out on the international marketplace to get your food. And the endpoints of each of the arrows is showing where Europeans are getting their food. Well, in order to produce the food, you got to have water, either in the form of rainfall, which you don't have on your European landscapes, you don't have enough of it, or in terms of irrigation water, either from groundwater or surface water. So there's this tabulation you can make of the virtual water that's associated with this globalization of trade. And that's what this diagram on the bottom shows. And in some cases, these fluxes of virtual water that are plugged into the global economy rival some of the fluxes that you would see in the atmosphere delivering water to particular places. Okay, so these are really the fundamental. These are really the fundamental two issues. So the point I'm trying to make. Remember the quote. What happens here stays here. I say it's the flip side. What happens here is generated elsewhere. That's really the way to look at that quote. This is evidence to indicate that if you're talking about a local impact, you better look a little bit farther afield to see where the source of those impacts are. Again, in this idea that what happens somewhere stays somewhere, doesn't stay somewhere, I'm showing here a picture that was developed from, I guess, the 2014 paper and then a 2011 paper that was attempting to create a map of the world's large reservoir systems. And for those of us who had studied hydrology, I think that era has passed. I think we're talking about an Earth system where you not only have natural fluxes of water that are captured by hydrological phenomena, but you also have hydraulic engineering. So the world's water systems of today, today's water systems are a composite, sort of a melding of natural flows and engineered flows. And there's a pandemic construction of dams and reservoirs for development. We needn't get into a battle about why these things are built. They're built to stabilize water flows so that humanity can economically develop. This is why, or create security against drought, or create protection against flooding, or create an irrigation water resource or a domestic water resource. And we want to get into a debate about that, I guess we can, but that's not really the purpose of this. It's just to simply show that the 21st century hydrosphere is now deeply connected to human decisions, okay? This is global dam and reservoirs that are currently mapped. There are about 6,000 of them, just parenthetically. There are more than 45,000 registered reservoirs, which have been nearly impossible for the community to map. So this is just a subset of all of the interventions that humans have made on the continental water cycle. We could only really map about 6,600 of these at the time of that study. And it will take a major effort to get all of the registered reservoirs onto the map. This is what we see existing today. And as you might expect, in particular with the rise of a middle class, since this served, many of the reservoirs are in the northern hemisphere, this served the needs of us as developed nations in terms of our economic security. If it served us well, you bet a dime to a dollar that it's serving the developing world well. And these are the planned or currently constructed reservoir systems, often in places that are extremely unique in terms of their biodiversity. And those who are concerned about this, especially from the biological sciences community, see this as a really devastating blow to global biodiversity. And yet, I look at it and I sort of shrug my shoulders and say, well, what else is one to expect? If we needed water infrastructure to develop in the rich countries, this is certainly going to be the case in the poor countries. Okay, so one of the connections here that we can articulate is that decisions made about how we are going to store and use water that are all over the continents. I mean, they're deep inside the continents. That those decisions ultimately reverberate to the coastal zone. And evidence for this is through a series of papers that have been published over the last 10 years that begin to articulate the sensitivity of coastal ecosystems to activities that water managers are doing upstream. And in the first such study, I did actually with a master's student back at the University of New Hampshire. It's back in 2006. We took 40 of the world's delta systems. And we asked the question, what are the main factors determining the vulnerability of coastal delta systems? And everyone, of course, is concerned about climate change and sea level rise, as we are. I'm not unconcerned about it. But when we began to look at this in a little bit more detail, we asked the question, well, what's the impact of all this reservoir construction that diverts water and, very importantly, sediment that used to flow down the rivers and spread out on the deltas and nourish the deltas? And what's the impact of local scale use of the delta? For example, extracting hydrocarbons as they do at the mouth of the Mississippi, where they don't replace the fluid and the delta basically sinks under its own weight because the liquid's taken out. Or what happens in the Nile Delta where they take irrigation water out and they don't replace it with anything, so it sinks. And we ranked these, so we built a little model and we ranked the sources of threat to these 40 deltas, where, incidentally, about 500 million people live. It's not an incidental landscape for human habitation. There are about 500 million people who live on these systems. And what we discovered, it's circled here, that of the 40 we looked at, only 5 had sea level rise as the dominant impact, as the dominant threat. 8 of them had groundwater and petroleum extraction as the dominant threat, and 27 had sediment trapping and diversion from water management literally thousands of kilometers upstream in many cases. Okay, so this is real, to us it's a real eye-opener that everyone concerned about sea level rise and global climate change, at least for deltas, was looking completely in the wrong direction. And again, in the spirit that what happens here doesn't stay here, these impacts on all these rivers, and just the colors just shows the main ingredient here. If you don't take into account these connectivities, you really do miss the boat. And that's why I really think it's important to look well beyond the local scale, because there are these interconnections that you might not have considered unless, by your very nature of thinking, you flew up to the 40,000 foot level and you look down. So you have to really back off the local impacts and begin to see patterns at the global scale. Okay, quote number 2, the president is the key. There are geologists here, I imagine. Anyone a geologist? Okay, so everyone who got a degree in geology must know this. The present is the key to the past. This is after Hutton and Lyell back in the 1700s and the 1800s. I think this is ridiculous with respect to water. This is nonsense with respect to water. Why do I believe that? Because if we look at the first articulation of the global impacts on water security from a series of databases that we developed or we pulled off the shelf that were sufficiently mature to actually analyze the question, we see that from land management, from pollution, from maladaptive or non-sustainable water management practices and biotic stress like introducing exotic species into waterways, we see a pandemic threat to the global water systems, the systems from which we draw our sustenance, from which we draw our water resources, and from which aquatic biodiversity must live, in which biodiversity must live. And the colors are meant to be intuitive. Wherever it's red, these are high threats. Wherever it's blue, it's low threats. So the high north is blue, where you would expect there are very few people. There's relatively little potential impact from these stressors here. But when you begin to look at this, you can look at a place like China, or you can look at a place like India, and you would expect, aha, these are places that have very poor environmental regulation. We know that they're rapidly developing. We know they're polluted. Those of us who've been there know that the water systems are a real mess there. And we can congratulate ourselves for getting red color for India and China. That's not too hard to do. Then we looked at the map and we said, oh my goodness, what's going on in Europe and what's going on in places like the United States, and I should also mention southern Canada. There are all sorts of insults there. And what's going on? We should know better because we have a very educated population. We have good water scientists. We have laws like the European Framework Directive in Europe, or in the U.S. we have EPA regulations to protect watersheds. But what's going on here? Why is it that we have such red coloration there? And that's because essentially we do a very poor job of protecting the environment. We allow these different stressors to accumulate in tandem with economic development. And we see evidence for that in terms of the developed world, but we also see evidence for that emerging here, for example, in Southeast Asia, where you see in Thailand, which is much more developed than a place like Laos, reds versus greens. And I've spoken to people from this region, and they say we pretty much have nailed the issue here. That as a consequence of economic development, Thailand has much more impact on its water systems than Laos, which is much less developed. Okay, and the bottom line here is that there are water management strategies that can prevent this from happening, but we don't use them. And this is the status quo. This is about year 2000, as close to the change of century as we could get. Okay? This is the present. The present is really determined by the past, in my view. And what I show here is a series of graphics of over a more than 100-year or more than 100-year time slice. So these all go from 1750 to the year 2000. These go from 1900 to 2000. If you look at what's going on in terms of planet Earth. You see the population rising exponentially. You see gross domestic product, economic development growing exponentially. Foreign direct investment growing exponentially, in particular over the last 50 years. You see fertilizer consumption going up. You see paper consumption going up. You see McDonald's restaurants going up. Motor vehicle transports, everyone's driving a car. Communications, international tourism, all these things are going up. And for water, I've just highlighted the fact that water withdrawals continue to go up. Dams and reservoirs are being built, and nitrogen pollution, which affects waterways, are all going up. And I think you'll agree that the inertia that's built into these graphics is not going to turn around on a dime. It's going to take an enormous amount of energy, effort, or catastrophe to change these upward trends that have so much century-scale inertia that it's absolutely no surprise to me that we see this kind of picture wherever you see this kind of exponential increase, where the increase in the drivers are way faster than our capacity to protect the systems. Okay? So I really want to throw out the Lyle and Hutton idea that the present is the key to the past. In terms of water, the past is the key to the present and probably the key to the future for the next many decades. That's my view. Okay, now quote number 3. I don't know if any of you ever followed this. I might be the only one who thought this is kind of funny. But back in the late 1970s, Bert Lance was President Carter's director of Office of Budget Management, and he was indicted on a really hokey set of charges, a small-town banking corruption, of which he was exonerated, but he brought great shame to the Carter White House, okay? But one of the things that he was talking about was basically not trying to dismantle functional parts of government. And so he said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And of course, the Republicans in my country at the time, and ever since, have thought this to be absolutely nonsense because they do see the whole government as being broken, and if it wasn't, they tried to break it, in my view. So anyway, so this has a really bizarre kind of twist to it. Now, in terms of water systems, I guess they call it the logical contrapositive. I think they call it the logical contrapositive is, if it is broke, fix it, okay? So what I wanted to do is show you what our view is of the services to humankind of water on planet Earth. Now, the map at the top shows a number of people who live downstream of source areas for water. So it's not a hydrology map, it's a hydrology service map. It's the water services that are conveyed to humanity, and the depth of color is the number of people who are served by the areas that generate runoff, okay? And this is just the physical amount of water. So interestingly, if you're a hydrologist, you know that this is crazy from the standpoint of seeing Amazonia, which should be dark blue because there's so much water. 15% of global runoff to the oceans comes from that part of the world. But it's very, very light colored. There are very, very few people who live in Amazonia, and they're served by this enormous resource of water, and it's kind of wasted on them. There's no people to benefit from it. Whereas there are loads and loads of people who live within densely packed parts of South Asia that absolutely depend on those source areas. Like millions of people depend on each of these 50-kilometer boxes, or the accounting unit we use. And there are loads and loads of people who have to depend on those water supplies. Not true in the Amazon, okay? Now, that's the amount of water, the number of people associated with the service of water, just in physical terms. Now, what we do, as you could probably detect from that earlier map that I showed you with all that red, we screw up all this water service by impairing the source area. So wherever you see red here, you see how this map has been recolorized with a set of colors. And again, the colors are intuitive. Wherever it's red, we have high impairment to those water services. And remember, I talked about this being a consequence of development, okay? So wherever you're rapidly developing or have experienced development, your mature economy, you're going to see a lot of red. So it takes this wonderful blue picture and it turns it red, and in many parts of the earth, yellow. So we take it and we screw it up. And 82% of the world's population is served by high-threat systems because we're really sloppy in the way we develop these systems. So that's the background from which we have to draw our water resources, or which biodiversity lives in. So this is what we call the incident threat condition. But of course, we're not going to stand for that in the developed world. So when I go back to my hotel tonight and I turn the faucet on, I get nice clean water, and I imagine for most of the time it's always there. It's very secure. How did we get to that point? Well, what we did is we invested about $750 billion a year, $0.75 trillion a year, to take this picture and repair it. And when you repair it, you see places like Europe and the United States and Japan, which were red, turned to nice blue, secure water. So what we see here is that we have an impairment and a repair. So we break it and then we fix it. So it's the contrapositive to what Bert Lance was talking about in terms of government services. Okay, we do break it, therefore we have to fix it. Now, of course, what happens is if you're in the developing world, the poor countries, you can't fix it because you don't have the money to fix it. So those are the people who are literally stranded by this philosophy and stewardship principle by which we manage our water. Okay, we can pay our way out of it. Okay, quote number 4. And when I prepared this slide, he was still living. But now this becomes a memorial to this baseball player, Yogi Berra from the New York Yankees, one of my heroes as a kid. He passed away a few days ago, actually. Quote number 4 comes from him. If you come to a fork in the road, take it. Okay, and he used to say crazy stuff like this. So if you come to a fork in the road, take it. Now, what could I possibly mean with respect to water systems? Okay. What I'm talking about actually has to do with the second debate in that series. So the first debate was on global versus local. Second debate was on securing water through traditional engineered gray infrastructure. Some people call it hard path infrastructure versus green infrastructure, natural capital, ecosystem services, environmentally based systems. And there's a tension in the community, in particular, as the Sustainable Development Goals have been now formulated. There was a real debate between the developed world countries that say that we need to think of environmental stewardship and developing world leadership that said, hey, that comes later, give us drinking water and sanitation, we'll deal with the environment later. So there's this tension, and it's a palpable tension in the community, and it was also quite palpable in terms of the design of the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so there's that debate. So on the left are a series of graphics that remind us that this gray infrastructure we're talking about, talk about big dams and reservoirs, big wastewater or big drinking water treatment facilities, interbasin transfers, large irrigation works. The mainstay of the water sector, okay, so they're the sector of the economy that generates $0.75 trillion of income per year. And the blueprint for that thinking comes to us from McKinsey, and there was an influential report written back in 2010 called Charting Our Water Future, where we find virtually no mention of the word ecosystem. Ecosystem services are absent. Biodiversity protection, not even mentioned. But dams, reservoirs, and this kind of infrastructure is mentioned. Flip side is, of course, using green infrastructure, using, for example, natural wetlands to attenuate pollution or to reduce potential flooding of systems that are downstream, making sure that these systems are intact so that you can generate fisheries that are, again, a protein source in many parts of the world downstream. And that's a different concept. It's ecological engineering, as it were. And there is that debate. And I don't think it's one or the other. I think we really need to be looking at both systems. For one thing, if you need really reliable systems, green infrastructure may fail you at precisely the moment you need to rely on it, whereas gray infrastructure may provide a bit more reliability. Yet gray infrastructure really does impose an enormous burden on biodiversity. Among all other parts of the Earth, the freshwater aquatic domain is most threatened and has lost the most species to date on a per area basis because it's such a fragile and such a rare part of the Earth system relative to oceans and relative to the land mass. And it has perhaps hundreds, if not 1,000 times faster species imperilment rates than counterparts in the terrestrial or the oceanic domain. So if you do decide to build a dam and you do decide to block a route of migration for an anadromous fish, you might be wiping out a very important population. And so that needs to be factored in to potential future decisions. We've actually been trying to map this out and to try to get a costing of the benefits of a green infrastructure. And what I show here is a somewhat complicated map, but what it shows is that there's a responsiveness to investments in infrastructure. And wherever you see blue, it's where people basically don't live. Okay, so there's not much you really need to do there. You don't have to put up big dams and reservoirs to protect human water security there. It's already there, but there are no people there. Okay, so those are relatively pristine parts of the Earth. There are these red areas, okay, like in Brazil, India, China, Central Asia, which have such environmental insult that they have to overcome, that they do a very poor job, as it were, of securing water even when they try to do so. It's just that the systems have very little green infrastructure left that would be functioning to a high enough level to make a difference at the global scale. The green areas are those where we do get absolutely great benefit from our expensive investments in traditional water infrastructure. Okay, so we already are doing a great job. We probably could do more, but there's lots of insult out there. So we don't even know how much green infrastructure we could rely on. The area where we think there's a big opportunity for green infrastructure to come into play in the 21st century is the area where it's yellow and orange. And there, the countries they're so poor right now that they cannot bring about a change in their water security relative to other parts of the Earth. But they could begin to work together with green infrastructure to bring about a material improvement in water security. That's the idea. And when we cost all of this out, we think that green infrastructure is probably worth about $300 billion or thereabouts, maybe $250 to $300 billion per year in terms of protecting the system from added insult. And if you didn't have that green infrastructure, you'd have to pay even more than the $750 billion to fix it. Okay, quote number 5. You can observe a lot just by watching. This is another one of his, I didn't make this up, this is what he really said. And those are very true words. So what's going on when I show this great acceleration here? I show the number of McDonald's restaurants going up exponentially, number of cars, all this water use. When we look at our capacity to understand, to observe what's going on, to watch it, like Yogi Berra said, to watch what's happening, the flow monitoring, the number of records that are in the UN-designated repository for this information has peaked in the year 1980. So this is year 1900. Sorry, that's out of focus. But this is year 1900. This is the year 2000. So about 1980, after a very admirable rise in the sharing of information by the nation states of the UN, the United Nations designated repository, which is located in Koblenz, Germany, has seen a precipitous decline in the stations that are reporting what ultimately is river flow and what ultimately is the measure of water supply for nations. The reason this happens is that there have been severe cutbacks in government agencies that are supporting the monitoring of these systems. There are intellectual property rights, privatization questions, and in some countries, like in India, these records are viewed as national security secrets. You could draw your own conclusions about what that means for adherence to treaties, international treaties. I won't, but I think you can fill in the blanks there. what about water use? So one of the defining characteristics of water stress or water crises is the mismatch between what's available and what's being used. And we traditionally put those two measures together, and where you have very little water supply relative to a big demand, you got problems. Well, in order to articulate that, we better have good reporting data. And this is, again, to the repository. This happens to be at FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And a little bit later, in the 1990s, we see an increase and then a precipitous decline. So same kind of deal. So how are we going to monitor what's going on with respect to water stress and water crises if we're not monitoring the basic features? And if you wanted to look at this for water quality and pollution, it's even in much worse shape. And I liken it to driving down the road. So there's this great acceleration, as they say, of humankind on planet Earth, defines the Anthropocene. Let's step on the accelerator. Oh, by the way, here's your blindfold. Let's go faster, and let's not really look at the stop signs, and so or the yield signs. So I don't know really what to make of this, except a blunder by humankind to figure out what we're facing. And if all this stuff is happening, why is it okay to monitor this stuff but not to monitor this stuff? It's beyond me. So anyway. Third great debate was watching water from sky or stream. I'm proud to announce that this was led on one side, the in situ side, the local stream side, as it were, by one of my students. The contrary view was led by Jay Famiglietti from UC Irvine and Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA, and he argued for the necessity of using satellite systems to gain insight about the global water crisis. Well, what was interesting was as this was moving forward, and again, I think the nature of the beast is we have to have both, but the satellite systems are extremely, extremely expensive. And there was basically a $1 billion soil measurement mission that was launched and was doing fine until a few days before the debate had come out in Science. And my old student, who was arguing for the old tried and true, let's get out there into the waterways and let's start monitoring this stuff the hard way, okay? This satellite, though, I should say the radar on this satellite, which made it really valuable in having the radar working, failed. And it failed because evidently an off-the-shelf part failed with no backup, because they never expected it, and I guess it never had failed before as far as I understand. And there was no backup, and they couldn't resuscitate the satellite. So the point that was able to be made in galley-proof stage for this is that these systems, whether they can do fantastic science or not, are prone to single-point failures. And you lost $1 billion, and if you had $1 billion to instrument the world's river systems, irrespective of any political issues of actually instrumenting sites, you would have quite a system of monitoring. And to put this in further detail, he and I made a calculation at one point that it would cost about $30 million a year to get a pretty good picture of the world's sustainable water resource flowing through rivers. So it'd be water supply from rivers. About $30 million a year to get a good global inventory. Okay, that would mean resources to do that. That's 0.004% of the $750 billion flowing into the water sector. I'm just trying to put this in perspective and really questioning why we can't make these kinds of investments. Or, a better way to look at it is a really small fraction or a fraction of Tiger Woods' annual earnings. And even though this guy hit some pretty big bumps in the road, it's amazing what this guy makes. He makes 50 million, 100 million, 80. He makes 2 years, 3 years worth of monitoring of the global hydrology, all because of his chip shots. And so I think there's some lessons to be learned here in terms of commitments to whether we really value our water systems. Okay, quote number 6, and this is what I teased the students with earlier this morning. There's a quote, I don't know who this guy is, but I found this quote on the web, and I thought it was really great. In our evolution, language has been the greatest single contribution to our understanding and misunderstanding. And I go back to the debate about global versus local perspectives. And this guy, Rashid, I think captures a very interesting concept. Because when I put this together with something called Engram, has anyone ever used Engram to track the usage of word pairings in different bodies of literature? This happens to be the corpus of English language books. Has anyone ever used it? If not, you should play around with it because you see some really interesting things. So what I did is I went to Engram, which is a Google product, and I put the word water shortage in, and I put the word water pollution in, okay? And these are kind of single issue topics, okay? And lo and behold, if you look from year 1900 to the year 2015, you see a very, very rapid rise in water shortage question with kind of a leveling off. Same for water pollution. And I should note that in the United States, we had laws that were trying to prevent water pollution that were drafted in the early 1970s, 1972 actually. And it's as though we said, okay, been there, done it, and it drops off. These are single issues, okay? These are single domain issues. More complicated issues are associated with something like the water crisis, which has elements of poverty alleviation, food security, pollution, engineering, all of that. It's a multi-dimensional beast, and it's slowly rising in terms of its usage, in terms of its recognition as an issue. And it's taken, 50 years to get to the point it is right now. Now, in terms of water governance, which goes along with managing the water crisis, I can't get okay, there it is. Water governance, it's taken literally 30 or 35 years to just see a little blip on the screen. And I think as an explanation of the global water crisis, which is now coming into vogue, first spoken about maybe in the early 1990s, it's hardly a blip, and guess what? The idea of global water governance, the thing that we debated in our first science piece, is not even part of the dialogue. So of course, if we come in there saying, you've got to be thinking about global water and global water governance, we're fighting a social trend of not ever really dropping those words into the lexicon. And so as I think all human endeavors, it takes time for people to acclimate to ideas, and it just takes a while for everyone to kind of get used to having a dialogue that's unthreatening to where they might be focusing their perspectives. And I think that would be an explanation for why we're even having this debate about global water and global water governance. Okay, so thanks for your attention, and thanks to Las Vegas and Hutton and Lyle, Lance and Ongalaru, and of course Yogi Berra, who is no longer with us. And I will put that up for you as a set of references that you can consult, because I didn't have time to go into all of the details. So thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. Maybe I can start off.
Sure.
The role of green infrastructure in water. For example, I think you highlighted Northeastern U.S. as a possibility. You talked a little bit about deltas, but more generally, what did you have in mind, and how feasible are they in these heavily regulated systems? Are you thinking about taking dams out of commission and that sort of thing? Or?
Yeah, I follow a little bit of the debate about taking dams out of commission, and I think dams that are dysfunctional should be taken out of commission. But I also realize, as you should as well, that all those dots that I showed on the screen probably represent several $1 trillion of investment that society has made in order to stabilize its water systems. And if you actually watched a animation, which I didn't show just in the interest of time, in the United States of the dam construction, you can see the westward expansion of the U.S. As people moved west, they stabilized their water system. So in the wake of the westward expansion, you would see very rapid impoundment of rivers to produce all sorts of benefits to humankind. So people put trillions of dollars of investment into these systems for good reason. They're not coming down. They're part and parcel of the 21st century hydrosphere. That's just part of it. That doesn't mean you should not try to optimize for the best operations of these systems so that you would actually be able to help ecosystems preserve the signatures that the organisms that live in those environments are looking for. They're looking for an annual, for example, in the temperate zone, they're looking for an annual flood pulse, okay, and they're looking for some occasional flooding of floodplains for nursery function, okay.
So you're looking for more intelligent use of dams with respect to environmental flows.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. However, by the same token, this becomes a virtually, I think, a virtually intractable optimization problem because there are 45,000 registered reservoirs. In the United States, I could have shown you 80,000 U.S. small and medium and large size reservoirs. And then there are probably about 1 million small farm ponds and things like this that are completely undocumented. These all accumulate in terms of their potential impact. So I don't think we would ever be in the position of doing this in a pandemic way. We could do this for selected areas where you have targeted species that you wish to preserve. But just doing this as a kind of a global optimization, I doubt the mathematics would even be solvable to do that. Although I was speaking to a optimization expert, Rezi, was you say?
Sama.
Yeah, and Sama too. I don't know if you guys want to do that, you try it, but that'll probably be the only thing you do for the rest of your life, academically. I think it's a pretty big problem. But you could target certain species that you want to preserve. Yeah.
More questions? Jeff usually twists the arms of the class, but he's not here.
Oh, yeah, he's not. Maybe we can get him in by phone. Skype him in.
Yeah, Amin.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk. How do you see the politics play in future planning? And what's your plan or your vision on that to engage politicians from different countries to get involved into this global governance issue and find a solution, actually?
Right. I think it's a slightly broader question than that. I think it also involves, in my view, the private sector. I think it's really, really important to be able to partner with private sector corporations that are looking to work with nature as opposed to constantly getting the contract for the hard engineering. Because the hard engineering, as beneficial as it might be immediately for humans, it has a long history of stressing ecosystems and stressing biodiversity. And in many cases, that's going to be a permanent debilitation of the natural system. In the future, and that's one of the reasons we're trying to put dollar numbers on this, okay? And these are not Canadian dollars, these are US dollars, by the way, that number that I showed. We want to put numbers on these so that we can articulate that these systems have value. And if you don't honor those systems, as it were, you don't protect the systems, you wind up paying much more. So that dialogue has to be really between scientists, economists, right, policy people from government, but the private sector and the body politic. I think that the civil society has to really have a voice in this as well. But I think together, if we have the concept that these are valuable services that go unrecognized, therefore we produce a lot of red on those maps. Every place you see red, you've destroyed the value of that ecosystem. And where it's really red, you've destroyed it to the point where you couldn't even use it if you decided to. You're well beyond that point, like in many parts of India and many parts of China. So the idea is to try to articulate to reasonably minded people who want to solve the problem, instead of entrenching themselves in their own, separate positions, is to say, how can we really join forces here? Let's use gray infrastructure where necessary. Let's use green infrastructure. Guess what? You get a running start on solving the problem if you use green infrastructure, and it might be on the order of maybe half of what you're paying the water sector to solve all these damaging problems. So that's the way I would look at that dialogue.
Laurie. Yeah.
Heather.
Hi. I have a question about you mentioned about world trade agreements. I don't know if you can speak directly to TPP because of the political controversy, or not controversy is not the word, but what is your opinion on current trade agreements that are out there? Are there any that you see that, from a virtual water perspective, are on track, or do you see most of them are missing the mark on virtual water global security?
Yeah, I don't think that the trade agreements, as far as I know, and I'm no expert on it, but what I've learned talking to people who know about these things is that they virtually have no concept of the impact on water systems. So this is all collateral benefit or damage is the way you wish to look at it. You know, you have to grow a crop that's demanded somewhere and you sell it, right? So that's part of the rules of the marketplace, right? There's a demand for a product. The producers come into the marketplace and they sell their products. In order to sell the products, they have to apply nitrogen. They have to apply tractor power. They might have to apply irrigation water. They also have, of course, rain-fed sources of water. And when you tabulate that, you can plug that into what ultimately would be the flow of goods through shipping, okay, that doesn't actually ship the water or the virtual nitrogen, but it's there, it's embedded, and you need it to produce it. And there have been studies that talk about the optimal recalculation of where the flows best should be distributed. So, for example, using just a basic principle of not depleting a non-sustainable groundwater resource, there would be no way that you could justify for international trade drawing down an aquifer in the midsection of the United States, like the Ogallala Aquifer. That's just going to continue to drop because it's not recharged in order to... That wouldn't be an optimal solution for sustainability, right? It just wouldn't be. However, parenthetically, I could say that aquifer is looked at like a petroleum resource, and it was designed to be depleted, actually. It was actually designed to be depleted. So, but in terms of sustainability, you can come up with these optimal mixes, but I'm not sure that the World Trade Organization at the moment would actually consider that, partly because water is only one of many commodities that enters into international trade. It's just one object. You have all sorts of other factors of production, like labor and mechanization and fertilizer and prices of different commodities relative to other parts of the world. All that factors in. And what might be optimal for water might be completely not optimal for phosphorus or nitrogen or potash, which I realize is important to this province.
Okay. Oh, Tolly, you can have the last question.
So you study global systems, and you were also talking about the importance of the local, so global and local. If you are somebody who studies the local, what do you think is the most important thing to understand from the global perspective in order to do the local more effectively?
Yeah. So I think it's a matter of perspective. Okay, so you're on the ground and you see that there are either intense sources of pollution or overuse of water, let's say for agriculture. And you focus on that as the issue. And you focus on ways in which, for example, to increase the efficiency of irrigation, more crops per drop of water there. And that's great to do. But if you don't realize that irrigated parcel of land is being irrigated because of a demand for a particular commodity, let's say, and I'll use the example, let's just say hay, fodder, that's grown in drought-stricken California that gets shipped to China. If you don't realize that the force that's making you crop at that location and laying on you the technical challenge is coming from somewhere else, you may actually invest in the wrong kind of thinking. You may want to invest in rolling off hay for export to China, and you might want to maybe grow some other crop or put that land aside till the drought is over and do some other economically productive activity. So the idea is one of perspective, and if you don't realize that the demand for use of that landscape and use of that water comes from somewhere else, you might be making the wrong local scale decision. So that's what I would say in answer to your question.
Yeah. Okay, I think this discussion could go on, but because we have the clock ticking, we need to close it down. Now, there will be refreshments in Louis? Alexander's, okay. So you're being whisked off.
Yes,
There's
to
a
be,
refreshments.
to be debriefed, I
To be
understand.
debriefed, and so if people would like to carry on the discussion, that can happen there. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd particularly like to thank Charlie for a very inspiring talk. It's quite interesting. Some of us heard Paul Hardesty yesterday talking about how Australia had managed its water challenges, and it's very interesting to have the two talks one after another. We certainly. I think it's very important for us to realise the global scale of these challenges, which influence so much of our water problems locally. So thanks for opening our eyes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
That's great.